September 1933, the dust from the county courthouse steps tasted like copper and shame. They'd set up a pine board across two sawhorses right there in front of Keene's company store, same as they did for the farm equipment auctions, except this wasn't a John Deere they was selling. Her name was Clementine Thatch, 19 years old, deaf in one ear from scarlet fever. Standing on that board in her dead mama's church dress while her daddy counted bid money like she was livestock. $43, they said. That's what a human soul was worth in the worst year the Depression ever gave us. I was 12. Uncle Oz told me to stay in the truck. I didn't. What happened next cost my uncle everything he'd worked for, nearly got us all killed, changed 3 lives forever. But I'm getting ahead of myself. By dawn, either we'd be free or buried 6 feet under. The company store stood at the corner of Main and Cedar, 2 stories of weathered clapboard with Keene's name painted across the front in letters tall enough to see from the county road. September heat pressed down like a wool blanket, the kind that makes your shirt stick to your back and your thoughts go slow and mean. Dust devils spun through the square where farmers' trucks lined up, beds empty because there wasn't nothing left to sell. The Depression had its teeth in our county good and deep by 33. Men who used to stand tall now walked with their eyes on the ground. Women wore dresses made from feed sacks, and nobody joked about it no more. Uncle Oz had driven into town for nails and kerosene. That's it. He didn't talk much on regular days, and after Aunt Beatrice died 8 years back, he talked even less. Just worked the sawmill, came home to our leaning house on the ridge, whittled his little wooden animals at night, and went to bed. The routine of a man trying to forget. I was supposed to stay in the truck, but I heard the crowd gathering, maybe 40 people forming a half circle near the store. And 12-year-old boys don't have the sense God gave a turnip. Women in feed sack dresses whispered behind their hands. Men in suspenders stood with arms folded, hats pushed back against the sun. Children peeked between legs, sensing something wrong but not understanding what. That's when I saw her. Clementine Thatch stood on that pine board like she was facing a firing squad. She wore a blue dress, faded at the seams, and a strand of blue glass beads around her neck that caught the light when she breathed. Her hands were clenched at her sides so tight her knuckles had gone bone white. She stared at a point somewhere above the crowd's heads, jaw set, like if she looked at anyone directly, she might shatter into 1,000 pieces. Beside her, swaying slightly, stood Elwood Thatch. His shirt was stained, his eyes red-rimmed like raw meat. The smell of cheap whiskey carried even from where I stood 20 feet back. "She can cook," Elwood was saying, voice too loud, words slurring at the edges. "Sews real fine. Can't hear good out of one ear, but she reads lips just fine. Anybody with $40 and a grain debt at the store can take her home tonight." My stomach turned over. A man in a brown suit called out, "She barren like they say?" "Don't know," Elwood shrugged. "Never been married, but she's strong, works hard, quiet." "Can she talk?" someone else asked. "Not clear. Scarlet fever took some of that when she was small, but she writes on a slate real pretty." He said it like he was selling a mule. Like the fact that his daughter could write her own name was a selling point for livestock. I looked around for Uncle Oz, found him standing near the back of the crowd, hat brim pulled low over his eyes. His face was stone, the kind of still that comes before an earthquake. I'd lived with him long enough to read the set of his shoulders, the way his hands hung loose at his sides but ready. He was angry, the kind of angry that goes real quiet before it explodes. The bidding started. A man with tobacco-stained teeth offered $35. Another went to 38, 40. Clementine's eyes were dry, but I could see her chest rising and falling too fast, like she couldn't get enough air. One tear escaped down her cheek. She didn't wipe it away, just let it fall. Then Uncle Oz's voice cut through the murmur like an axe through pine. $43 and whatever grain debt is owed to the store. The crowd turned as one. Heads swiveling, whispers spreading like wildfire. Elwood's bloodshot eyes went wide. "You serious, Landry?" Uncle Oz walked forward slow and deliberate, boots kicking up dust with each step. He pulled a leather pouch from his coat pocket, the one he kept his savings in, the one he'd been filling for 8 years with money meant for, I don't know what. Maybe nothing. Maybe just the comfort of having something put by. He counted out bills and coins on the board beside the bid jar. Slow. Each piece of money hitting the wood like a judgment. "That's 2 months' wages," someone muttered behind me. Uncle Oz didn't look at the crowd, didn't look at Clementine, just kept his eyes locked on Elwood Thatch. "Debt's paid," Uncle Oz said, voice flat as a saw blade. "She's free of it." Elwood reached for the money with shaking hands, but Uncle Oz's fingers closed over his wrist, not rough but firm. "You go home now," Uncle Oz said quietly. "You sober up, and you don't come back here asking for more. Ever. We clear?" Elwood nodded, grabbed the money, and disappeared into the crowd before anyone could object or ask questions or do anything to stop the transaction. Uncle Oz turned to Clementine for the first time. She was trembling now, silent tears running tracks through the dust on her face. He pulled a faded red handkerchief from his pocket and held it out to her. She didn't take it, just stared at him like she couldn't understand what language he was speaking. "I ain't asking you for nothing," Uncle Oz said, voice low enough that only those closest could hear. "But you can't stay here, not after this. So if you want to come with me until you figure something else out, my truck's over there." He pointed to our battered Ford at the edge of the square. Clementine looked at the handkerchief, at Uncle Oz, at her father's retreating back, disappearing between buildings, at the crowd watching her like she was a curiosity at a traveling show. Then she bent down, picked up a small cloth satchel at her feet, everything she owned in the world, I reckoned, and walked toward our truck without a word or a backward glance. The crowd murmured. Some folks looked uncomfortable, like they'd just witnessed something they shouldn't have. Others looked satisfied, like justice had been served or at least delayed. A few women dabbed at their eyes with the corners of their aprons. Uncle Oz followed her, and I scrambled after both of them, my heart pounding in my chest for reasons I couldn't name yet. We'd barely made it to the edge of town, dust still hanging in our wake, when Marshal Clyde Breckenridge stepped into the middle of the road, hand raised like he was stopping a stampede. His badge caught the sunlight. Behind him stood 3 deputies, hands resting casual-like on their gun belts. Uncle Oz braked hard. I lurched forward, catching myself on the dashboard. Clementine's hands gripped the door handle, knuckles white all over again. The marshal walked to the driver's side window, slow and deliberate, like a man who had all the time in the world and knew it. "Oswin Landry?" he said, voice carrying that peculiar mix of respect and warning that lawmen learn. "We need to talk about the legality of what you just done." Uncle Oz's jaw tightened, but his voice stayed level. "Nothing illegal about paying a man's debt, Marshal." "No, sir, there ain't." Breckenridge leaned down, resting one hand on the truck's mirror. "But there's plenty illegal about an unmarried man taking a woman of marriageable age home without proper arrangements, especially with a minor boy living under the same roof." In the rearview mirror, I watched 3 more trucks pull onto the road behind us, blocking any chance of backing up or turning around. We weren't going anywhere. Marshal Breckenridge straightened up, hooking his thumbs in his belt. "You got 3 days, Landry. You figure out proper arrangements, legal guardianship, employment papers, something that satisfies the law, or I'm bringing Miss Thatch to the county poor farm. That's not a threat. That's the law." Uncle Oz's hands tightened on the steering wheel until I heard the leather creak. "3 days," the marshal repeated. Then he stepped aside and waved us through. As we rolled past, I looked back and saw him watching us with an expression I couldn't read. Not quite hostile, not quite friendly. Something in between, like a man doing a job he didn't entirely believe in but would do anyway, because that's what the badge required. Clementine sat pressed against the passenger door, staring straight ahead, her cloth satchel clutched in her lap like a shield. 3 days to figure out the impossible. 3 days before everything we'd just done would be undone by the very law that was supposed to protect people like her. The road stretched out before us, leading up to the ridge where our house waited. The house that suddenly felt a whole lot smaller and a whole lot more complicated than it had that morning. The ride home was silent except for the rattle of the truck over ruts and the occasional pop of gravel hitting the undercarriage. Clementine sat pressed against the passenger door like she was trying to make herself smaller, disappear maybe. I sat between her and Uncle Oz, trying not to stare but failing. Our house came into view as we crested the ridge, A lean-to of a place that tilted slightly westward like it was tired of standing upright. The porch sagged in the middle. One shutter hung crooked. Behind it, the sawmill's blade tower rose against the sky, idle on a Sunday. Uncle Oz killed the engine. The sudden quiet felt loud. "Ain't much," he said, not looking at either of us. "But the roof don't leak and the stove works." Clementine climbed down without waiting for help. She stood in the yard, taking in the chickens scratching in the dirt, the leaning fence posts, the laundry line with my torn shirts still hanging from yesterday. Her face gave nothing away. I grabbed her satchel before she could. She turned, startled, and I got my first real look at her eyes up close, gray-blue, like storm clouds. Pretty in a worn-out way, like good cloth that's been washed too many times and has gone soft at the edges. "I'm Silas," I said, probably too loud. Then remembered she was deaf on one side and felt stupid. She pulled a small slate and piece of chalk from her dress pocket, the kind school kids use, and wrote in neat, careful script. "Which side?" I pointed to my right ear. She nodded once and shifted to stand on my left. Uncle Oz was already heading inside with the kerosene. We followed. The house was clean but bare. One main room with a wood stove, a table, two chairs that didn't match. A ladder led up to a loft where I slept on a corn husk mattress. Uncle Oz's room was off to the side, door always half open, like he was listening for something that never came. What always stood out, was the rocking chair by the window. Nobody ever sat in it. Uncle Oz wouldn't, and he'd never told me why directly, but I'd figured it out on my own. That's where Aunt Beatrice died, holding the baby that never drew breath. The chair where life ended instead of beginning. Clementine walked straight to it and sat down, not knowing. Uncle Oz froze in the doorway, water bucket in his hand. His face went pale as flour. For a moment I thought he might shout, might tell her to get up, get out, don't touch that. But he just set the bucket down careful and walked back outside without a word. I didn't know what to say, so I blurted, "You hungry? I can make cornbread." "Well, I can try. Usually burns." She looked at me for a long moment, then wrote on her slate, "I can cook." "Uncle Oz says you don't got to do nothing. You're not—" I struggled for the word. "Obligated." She erased with the heel of her hand and wrote again. "What am I then?" I didn't have an answer for that. Clementine made supper without being asked. Real supper, not the half-burnt beans and hard biscuits me and Uncle Oz had been surviving on for months. She found flour in the cupboard, lard in the icebox, eggs from the henhouse I didn't know we still had. Within an hour, the smell of actual cooking filled the house, onions frying, biscuits rising, something that smelled like hope. Uncle Oz came in when she rang the dinner bell we hadn't used since Aunt Beatrice passed. He'd washed his face and hands at the pump, but sawdust still clung to his hair like snow. He sat at the table looking uncomfortable, like he'd forgotten what it felt like to be cared for by someone else. We ate in silence. The food was good, better than good. When I reached for seconds, Clementine's mouth twitched in what might have been a smile, and it changed her whole face from haunted to almost human. After supper, she washed dishes while Uncle Oz sat on the porch whittling. I watched her through the window, the way she moved around the kitchen like she was memorizing where everything went, filing it away for future use. She found Aunt Beatrice's apron hanging on a nail behind the door and put it on without asking. Through the window, Uncle Oz saw it. His carving knife slipped, cut his thumb deep. Blood welled up dark and thick. He didn't even flinch, just wrapped it in his handkerchief and kept carving like nothing had happened. That night, Uncle Oz gave Clementine his room. "I'll sleep in the mill office," he said, already gathering his blanket. "Ain't proper otherwise." She wrote on her slate, "You paid my father's debt. You don't owe me anything more." "Didn't do it to own you," he said quietly, not meeting her eyes. "Did it because no human being should be sold like livestock. You stay long as you need. Leave when you want. That's the only rule here." She stared at him for a long moment, slate pressed against her chest. Then she nodded once and disappeared into the room, closing the door soft behind her. I was half asleep in the loft when I heard it. Horses. Multiple. Coming up the ridge road fast, hooves pounding dirt like drums. I crawled to the window and looked out into the darkness. Torches. 6 of them, bobbing in the night like angry fireflies. Men on horseback, moving with purpose, moving with intent that wasn't friendly. Below me, Uncle Oz stepped onto the porch, shotgun in hand. The boards creaked under his weight. A voice called from the darkness, rough and carrying. "Oswin Landry, send the girl out. We're here to talk some sense into you." I heard movement behind me. Clementine was climbing the ladder to the loft, still in Aunt Beatrice's old nightdress we'd found in the trunk. In the moonlight streaming through the window, I could see she was holding her slate. She'd written one word in shaky letters. Why? I didn't have an answer. Didn't understand why people couldn't just leave us alone, why doing the right thing always seemed to bring trouble instead of peace. Below, the torches were getting closer. I could make out faces now. Vernon Hobbs from the feed store, Carl Pritchett, who worked the mill's kiln, and leading them on a bay mare like he owned the whole damn world. Dalton Keene, the mill owner's son. "Landry!" Dalton's voice carried, slurred slightly with drink. "You've caused quite a stir in town. Time we had a talk about propriety and reputation." Uncle Oz pumped the shotgun once. The sound cut through the night like a knife through butter. Sharp, clear, final. "I got nothing to say to you boys," Uncle Oz called back. "And you got no business on my property at this hour. Turn those horses around and go home before somebody gets hurt." "That a threat, Landry?" "That's a promise." The torches stopped advancing, but they didn't retreat. They just sat there on their horses, flames dancing, shadows jumping across the yard like demons at play. Clementine gripped my arm so tight it hurt. Her slate had fallen to the loft floor. In the dim light, I could see new words written there. "This is my fault. I should go." But even as I read it, I knew Uncle Oz would never let that happen. Below us, one of the men called out, "We know the law, Landry. Marshall gave you 3 days. But we're saying you don't got 3 days. You got tonight to make this right, or we'll make it right for you." The torches surged forward, and Uncle Oz raised that shotgun to his shoulder, steady as a church steeple in a storm. Uncle Oz stood on that porch with the shotgun resting across his forearm, not aimed at anyone specific, but ready, present, real. I'd seen him handle that gun my whole life, squirrel hunting mostly, sometimes scaring off coyotes that got too close to the chickens. But I'd never seen him hold it like this, like it was an extension of his arm, like it meant business. 6 men on horses formed a half circle in our yard. Their torches cast jumping shadows across the house, making everything look distorted and wrong. I recognized most of them. Vernon Hobbs from the feed store, thin as a fence post with a nervous tick in his left eye. Carl Pritchett, who worked the mill's kiln, a good man usually but weak when drink and groupthink took hold. And leading them, sitting a bay mare like he was surveying his kingdom, was Dalton Keene. 30 years old, soft hands, the kind of man who gave orders instead of doing work. Dalton wore a pressed shirt even at midnight. His face was flushed red with whiskey courage. "Landry," he called out, voice carrying authority he hadn't earned, "you've caused quite a stir in town today." Uncle Oz didn't move, didn't blink. "Then maybe y'all should have stayed in town." "We're here as concerned citizens," Vernon added, his voice shaking slightly despite the torch in his hand. "What you done today, buying that girl, it ain't right. I paid a debt, nothing more." Carl Pritchett spat tobacco juice into the dirt. "You brought her to your house. Unmarried man. Boy living here too. People are talking, Oz, saying things. Bad things. Let them talk." Dalton leaned forward in his saddle, and I could smell the whiskey from 20 feet away. "My father employs you, Landry. You're the foreman of his mill. That position means something in this county. It carries weight, respect. You represent the Keene operation. This situation reflects poorly on all of us." "Then fire me." The words hung in the air like smoke. Dalton's eyes narrowed. "Don't tempt me." "I ain't tempting nothing. I'm stating fact. You got a problem with my personal affairs. Take it up with your daddy. But right now, you're trespassing on my property at midnight with torches and threats, so I'll say it one more time. Turn those horses around and go home." Uncle Oz finally raised the shotgun, not pointing it at anyone, just shifting it so the barrel caught the torchlight. The metal gleamed dull and final. "She ain't property," Uncle Oz said, voice low and hard as railroad iron. "Not while I'm breathing. Now you boys can turn those horses around and ride back to town, or you can explain to your wives why you got buckshot in your backsides over something that ain't your damn business." Nobody moved for a long moment. The horses shifted, nervous. Vernon's torch wavered. Then I did something stupid. I stepped out onto the porch beside Uncle Oz, holding that rusty old pistol we kept for snakes. My hands were shaking so bad I probably couldn't have hit the barn at 10 paces, but I stood there anyway, trying to look braver than I felt. "Silas, get back inside," Uncle Oz said through his teeth, not looking at me. "No, sir." He looked at me then, quick, and something passed between us. Not approval exactly, but maybe understanding. Maybe recognition that sometimes standing up is more important than standing smart. Behind us, the door opened. Clementine stepped out onto the porch, still in that nightdress, barefoot, her slate clutched in her hands. She'd written something and held it up to the torchlight. "I will leave if it stops this." The words were shaky but clear. "You ain't going nowhere," Uncle Oz said, voice cracking like a whip. He didn't take his eyes off the mob. "Not because of these fools." He turned his full attention back to the men. "You want to blame somebody? Blame me. But this girl's been through enough without a mob showing up at midnight to shame her some more. She's done nothing wrong. Neither have I. And if Marshal Breckenridge has an issue with the legality of it, he can come talk to me in daylight like a civilized human being, not hide behind you boys and your liquid courage." Dalton's face flushed deeper red. "My father will hear about this insubordination." "I reckon he will." "You're making a mistake, Landry, a big one. Wouldn't be my first. Won't be my last." Uncle Oz's voice dropped lower, more dangerous. "Now get off my land before I decide that warning shot I mentioned earlier ain't gonna stay a warning." The men exchanged glances. Vernon looked downright uncomfortable now, like he was regretting the whole enterprise. Carl seemed almost relieved to have an excuse to back down. Only Dalton held his ground, pride and whiskey making him stupid. "3 days," Dalton finally said, pulling his horse's reins tight enough to make it dance sideways. "That's what the marshal said. Proper arrangements or she goes to the county poor farm." "We'll make sure he holds to it, Landry. We'll make damn sure. You do that." They turned their horses, slowly, letting the torches swing wide to make sure we saw them leaving on their terms, not ours. But they were leaving, and that's what mattered. Dalton paused at the edge of the yard, silhouetted against his torch. "You're choosing her over your livelihood, over your reputation, over everything you've built here. I hope she's worth it." Uncle Oz's response was quiet, but carried clear. "She's a human being. That makes her worth it." The mob rode away, hoofbeats fading down the ridge road, torchlight disappearing into the pines until we were left standing in darkness broken only by moonlight. Uncle Oz lowered the shotgun. His hands were steady, but when he spoke, his voice was rough, scraped raw. "Silas, you ever pull a fool stunt like that again, stepping out here with a gun you can't shoot, I'll tan your hide from here to Sunday." "Yes, sir." "But—" He paused, and I heard him swallow hard. "You stood up when it mattered. That counts for something." I felt warmth spread through my chest, despite the fear still making my legs shake. Clementine's slate clattered to the porch boards. She'd erased her previous message and written new words. "Thank you for not sending me away." Uncle Oz looked at her then, really looked at her, and his expression softened in a way I hadn't seen since Aunt Beatrice died. "You don't thank a man for doing what's right," he said quietly. You just stand with him when the next mob comes, because there's always a next mob." We were turning to go inside, adrenaline finally fading and leaving exhaustion in its wake, when a single horse came back up the road. No torch this time, just moonlight glinting off a badge. Marshal Clyde Breckenridge dismounted slow, hands visible and empty, moving with the careful deliberation of a man who didn't want to get shot by accident. "Put the gun away, Oz," he said, not unkindly. "I ain't here with them." Uncle Oz lowered the shotgun, but didn't set it down. "Then why are you here, Marshal?" Breckenridge pulled a folded paper from his coat pocket. Official looking, with a seal at the bottom that caught the moonlight, legal paper. The kind that changed lives whether you wanted it to or not. Because, as of tomorrow morning, Judge Blackwell is issuing a writ of moral turpitude against your household. If you can't prove proper guardianship arrangements by Thursday noon, I'm legally obligated to remove Miss Thatch to county custody. He laid the paper on the porch rail, careful not to come too close. Poor farm, most likely. Maybe the church asylum if they got room. The words hit like fists. That's 2 days, Uncle Oz said, voice hollow. I know. 2 days to do what? Marry her? She's young enough to be my daughter, Marshall. That'd be worse than what they're accusing me of now. I know that too, Oz. But the law's the law. Breckenridge's face was troubled, shadows making him look older than his 50-some years. I'm sorry, I truly am. But my hands are tied here. He mounted his horse, paused, looked back. For what it's worth, I think you did a good thing today. A right thing. But right don't always line up with legal, and legal's what I got to enforce. He rode away, leaving us standing in moonlight with 2 days to figure out the impossible. Clementine's slate hit the porch boards with a crack that sounded like breaking bone. She'd written, I should have stayed sold. Uncle Oz picked up the slate, looked at the words, then looked at her. His jaw was set, but his eyes were wet. No, he said firmly. You should have been born into a world that don't sell people, but we can't change that. We can only change what happens next. What does happen next? I asked, voice small and scared. Uncle Oz, what are we going to do? He looked at the legal paper on the railing, at Clementine standing barefoot and trembling in the moonlight, at me with my rust bucket pistol still clutched uselessly in my hands. I don't know yet, boy, he admitted, and hearing him say those words scared me more than the mob had. But we got 2 days to figure it out, so let's get some sleep and start fresh in the morning. Except none of us slept that night. We just sat on that porch until dawn, watching the road for whatever was coming next, knowing that legal papers and good intentions weren't going to be enough to stop it. Morning came too soon and brought no answers with it. I woke to voices downstairs, Uncle Oz and someone else, female. I scrambled down the ladder in my undershirt and trousers, feet bare on the cold boards. Marjorie Keene sat at our table, a cup of coffee steaming in her weathered hands. She was maybe 60, silver hair pulled back tight, dressed in a simple gray dress that probably cost more than our whole house but didn't show it. The mill owner's wife, but not like her son. She had kind eyes that had seen hard things and soft hands that remembered work. Clementine stood by the stove, rigid as a fence post, hands gripping the edge of the counter so tight her knuckles showed white. Silas, Uncle Oz said when he saw me, go feed the chickens. But now. His tone left no room for argument, but I didn't go far. Just stood by the kitchen window where I could hear everything through the gap in the frame. Mrs. Keene's voice carried clear. My husband is a practical man, Oswin. He won't fire you outright. You're too valuable to the mill. But Dalton has convinced him that your position as foreman is compromised. The sound of Uncle Oz's coffee cup hitting the table was sharp. So I'm being demoted. Not demoted, reassigned, back to the mill floor. Same pay initially, but... She paused, and I heard the weight of bad news coming. But no supervisory role, no authority, and Dalton will be overseeing operations directly now. Working under the man who threatened me last night. Uncle Oz's voice was flat, dead. That's rich. I know. I'm sorry. Mrs. Keene's voice softened. But Oswin, there is another way, if you're willing to consider it. Silence stretched long enough that I risked a glance through the window. Uncle Oz sat with his head in his hands. Clementine hadn't moved from the stove. I need household help, Mrs. Keene continued. My last girl left to get married 2 months ago. I can hire Miss Thatch as live-in domestic staff. She'd have a room in our house, proper wages, full legal protection as an employee of the Keene household. More silence. The marshal couldn't touch her then, Mrs. Keene pressed gently. She'd be under my direct sponsorship, protected, safe. But she couldn't live here anymore, Uncle Oz said slowly, understanding dawning. Could she? No, not if we're going to make this legal and proper. The arrangement only works if there's clear separation. She'd be my employee, living under my roof. You'd be, well, you'd just be the man who paid her father's debt and found her respectable employment. I watched Uncle Oz's shoulders sag like something inside him had broken. Clementine moved then. She walked to the table, slate in hand, and wrote quickly before holding it up for them both to see. I accept. Uncle Oz's head snapped up. You don't have to. She erased it fierce and wrote again. You've lost enough. I won't be the reason you lose more. That ain't your decision to make. Yes, it is. Her chalk pressed so hard against the slate it squeaked. You gave me choice. I'm choosing. Uncle Oz stared at her, something like pain crossing his face. Clementine. She shook her head, erased, wrote, This is the only way that doesn't destroy you. Mrs. Keene stood, reading the room with the practiced ease of someone who'd navigated difficult conversations her whole life. Then it settled. I'll inform Marshal Breckenridge this morning. The legal paperwork will take a day or two, but he'll accept my word. Miss Thatch, can you be ready by this afternoon? Clementine nodded. Good. I'll send our wagon at 2 o'clock. Mrs. Keene moved toward the door, then paused. Oswin, for what it's worth, my husband wanted to fire you outright. I talked him down to reassignment. It's the best I could do. I know. Thank you, Marjorie. After she left, Uncle Oz sat at that table for a long time without moving. Finally, he stood and walked out the back door toward the sawmill without a word to either of us. I burst through the front door. You can't leave! Clementine turned to me, eyes red but dry. She wrote on her slate, I have to. But you just got here. I didn't know what we were gonna do, but it felt like something important was being ripped away before it even started. Uncle Oz needs you. He won't say it, but he does. She knelt down to my level, which nobody ever did. Adults always talk down to you, and wrote carefully. He needs his job more, and you need him to keep his dignity. That's stupid. That's sacrifice. She erased it and wrote again. Someday you'll understand. When you're older and you love someone, you'll know that sometimes the bravest thing isn't staying. It's leaving so they can survive. I don't want to understand, I said, voice cracking. I want you to stay. Her hand touched my cheek, gentle, and then she stood and went to pack her meager belongings. I found Uncle Oz at the mill, sitting on a stack of lumber with a piece of wood in his hands, carving without seeing. Wood shavings fell around his boots like snow. She's really going? I asked. Seems so. You gonna let her? His knife stopped moving. Ain't about letting, Silas. She's making her own choice. That's what freedom means. The right to choose wrong if you want to. How's it wrong to stay with people who care about you? It ain't. But it's right to protect those people from consequences they didn't sign up for. He looked at me then, and I saw how tired he was, how old. She's trying to save me, boy. Question is whether I'm man enough to let her. What if you said no? What if you told Mrs. Keene to keep her job and we'd figure something else out? Then in 2 days, the marshal comes and takes her anyway. At least this way, she goes to a good place, safe place. His voice cracked. At least this way, I know she's protected. We sat in silence while the sun climbed higher and the moment of her leaving drew closer. The wagon arrived at 2 o'clock exactly. Mrs. Keene's driver, an older black man named Samuel, helped load Clementine's single satchel into the back. It looked even smaller sitting in that big wagon bed. Everything she owned in the world, and it barely made a dent. Clementine stood in our yard one last time, wearing the same blue dress from the auction, her mother's beads catching afternoon light. She held her slate, but she hadn't written anything yet. Uncle Oz came down from the mill, sawdust in his hair, hands still stained with wood and work. They stood facing each other, not speaking, not touching. Finally, she wrote, Thank you for 3 days of safety. It was more than I expected. Uncle Oz's jaw worked. It wasn't enough. It was everything. He looked like he wanted to say more, argue more, but Mrs. Keene's driver cleared his throat gently. Ma'am, we should go. Mrs. Keene likes supper preparations started by 4. Clementine climbed into the wagon. She didn't look back as they rolled away. Uncle Oz stood watching until the dust settled and the wagon disappeared around the bend toward town. Then he walked to the mill without a word and didn't come out until well past dark. I sat on the porch alone, feeling like something vital had been cut out of our lives before it even had a chance to grow. 3 days later, I was collecting eggs when I heard horses coming up the ridge road. Fast. Multiple riders. My stomach dropped. Uncle Oz was at the mill. I ran to get him, but he was already coming out, having heard the hoofbeats too. This time it wasn't 6 men, it was 12. And they weren't carrying torches in the daylight. They were carrying rope. Dalton Keene sat his horse at the front, face hard and sober this time. No whiskey courage needed in broad daylight with numbers on his side. "Oswin Landry," he called out, "by order of the mill ownership and in accordance with your employment contract, you are hereby evicted from company property. You have 1 hour to gather your belongings and vacate the premises." Uncle Oz stood frozen. "What?" A thin man in a suit, the mill's lawyer, stepped forward with papers. "Mr. Landry, as per your signed employment agreement from 1925, company housing is contingent upon active employment in a supervisory capacity. As you've been reassigned to floor work, you no longer qualify for this residence. You have 60 minutes. My legs went weak. "Uncle Oz?" He didn't answer, just stood there while everything he'd worked for, everything he'd built, crumbled to dust in front of him. And the worst part, the absolute worst part, was that Clementine wasn't even here anymore to know that her sacrifice had been for nothing. We were losing the house anyway. We had 1 hour to pack a lifetime. I ran through the house grabbing things, my clothes, Uncle Oz's tools, the tin of coffee, anything that seemed important. My hands were shaking so bad, I kept dropping things. Uncle Oz moved slower, methodical, like he was walking through a dream he couldn't wake from. He packed his clothes, his shaving kit, Aunt Beatrice's Bible. The wooden animals he'd carved went into a flour sack, careful like they mattered more than furniture. 40 minutes in, another wagon came up the road, not the mill's. This one belonged to Moses Freeman, and behind him came 3 more trucks. Mill workers, every one of them. Moses jumped down before his wagon even stopped. "Oz, we heard. Came to help." "Ain't nothing to help with, Moses. It's done." "The hell it is." Moses turned to the men. "Load everything. We'll store it at my place until Oz figures things out." Uncle Oz's voice cracked. "I can't ask you to." "You ain't asking. We're doing." Moses gripped his shoulder. "You stood up for what's right. Now we stand with you." They worked fast. Bed frame, table, chairs, everything that could be moved. The lawyer stood watching with his pocket watch, counting down the minutes like he was timing a horse race. When the hour was up, we stood in an empty house that suddenly felt like it had never been ours at all. "Time's up, Landry," the lawyer called. "Keys." Uncle Oz pulled the house key from his pocket, the same key he'd carried for 8 years, and dropped it in the man's palm without a word. We climbed into Moses's wagon. Dalton Keene sat his horse, watching us leave with satisfaction written plain across his face. As we rolled down the ridge road, I looked back one last time. Our house, the only home I'd ever known, stood empty on that hill, door open, windows dark, gone. Moses took us to his place, a small house on the edge of town with barely enough room for his own family, but he made space anyway. His wife Ruth fed us supper, beans and cornbread, while their 3 grandchildren stared at us like we were curiosities at a traveling show. That night, Uncle Oz sat on Moses's porch, whittling by lantern light. I sat beside him, not knowing what to say. "I'm sorry, Uncle Oz." "For what? You didn't do nothing wrong." "I should have stayed in the truck that day. Then none of this would have happened." His knife stopped moving. "Silas, you listening? None of this is your fault. Ain't Clementine's fault either. It's just the way things are when you try to do right in a world that runs on wrong." "Then why do it? Why stand up if it just costs you everything?" He was quiet for a long time. "Because the cost of not standing up is higher. You lose things, sure. House, job, whatever. But those things can be replaced. What can't be replaced is the man you see in the mirror. You compromise on dignity once, it gets easier the second time. And before you know it, you're the kind of man who watches girls get sold and tells himself it ain't his business. He handed me a carved bird, a sparrow, detailed and delicate. I ain't that man, won't ever be that man, even if it costs me everything. The next morning, Marshal Breckenridge arrived at Moses's house. My stomach dropped, thinking he'd come to make things worse somehow. But his face was troubled, not triumphant. Oz, can we talk? Private? They walked to the edge of Moses's property, near the fence line. I watched from the porch, trying to read their body language. The marshal was doing most of the talking, hands gesturing, face serious. Uncle Oz stood rigid, listening. When they came back, Uncle Oz's expression was unreadable. "What is it?" I asked. "What's wrong?" "Marshall says Clementine's asking for us. Wants us to come to the Keene house tonight, after supper." "Why?" "Don't know. But Breckenridge says it's important." Moses offered his wagon. At dusk, we rode into town, past the mill that used to employ Uncle Oz, past the company store where Clementine was sold, up to the big house on the hill where the Keene family lived. Mrs. Keene met us at the door herself, which was unusual. Rich folks usually sent servants for that. "Oswin, Silas, come in." The house smelled like beeswax and money, clean and cold and foreign. She led us to the parlor where Clementine sat on a settee, wearing a simple gray dress Mrs. Keene must have given her. When she saw us, her face lit up in a way that made my chest hurt. She stood quickly, slate already in hand. "I heard what happened. They took your house." Uncle Oz nodded. "Ain't your concern." She erased it fierce and wrote, "Everything about you is my concern." Before Uncle Oz could respond, Mrs. Keene spoke. "There's something you both need to know. Something I discovered today that changes everything." She pulled papers from a folder on the side table. Legal documents, dense with words I couldn't read from where I stood. When I filed the employment paperwork for Clementine, I had my lawyer review her father's debt at the company store. The original loan documents. "And?" Uncle Oz asked. "And they're fraudulent. Elwood Thatch never borrowed money for grain. He borrowed it for medicine, for his wife. But the store clerk recorded it as grain debt, which carries different interest rates, higher rates. And the amount Elwood owed should have been paid off 18 months ago. They've been collecting on a debt that didn't exist." The room went silent. "What are you saying?" Uncle Oz asked slowly. "I'm saying the sale was illegal. The debt was false. Which means—" Mrs. Keene looked at Clementine. "Which means you were never legally sold. You were stolen through fraud." Clementine's slate clattered to the floor. Mrs. Keene continued, "I brought this to Judge Blackwell this afternoon. He's issuing a warrant for the store clerk's arrest, and he's nullifying any claim Elwood Thatch or the company store had over Clementine." She paused. "She's free. Completely and legally free." "Free," Uncle Oz repeated, like he was testing how the word tasted. "Yes, no guardianship needed, no employment arrangement required. She can go wherever she wants, live wherever she chooses." Mrs. Keene smiled. "The law that was being used against you has now become your protection." Clementine picked up her slate with shaking hands and wrote, "Then I choose to stay with you, if you'll have me." Uncle Oz's eyes went wet. "Girl, I got no house, no job beyond mill floor work. I'm staying with Moses in a house barely big enough for his own family. I got nothing to offer you except—" She held up her hand to stop him and wrote quickly, "You offered me dignity when no one else would. You offered me choice when I'd been treated like property. You stood against mobs and lost everything rather than send me away. That's not nothing. That's everything." Uncle Oz's voice was rough. "You sure? You could stay here? Mrs. Keene's house is safe, comfortable." "I don't want safe and comfortable. I want family." The moment broke when Moses burst through the front door, not bothering to knock. His face was pale, urgent. "Oz, we got trouble." "What kind?" "It's Elwood Thatch. He left the sober house 2 hours ago. Took a kitchen knife with him." My blood went cold. "Where's he headed?" Marshal Breckenridge asked, materializing from somewhere in the house. Deputy spotted him on the road toward Moses's place. "He's drunk, Oz, real drunk. And he's muttering about—" Moses glanced at Clementine. "About unfinished business." Uncle Oz was already moving. He's going after the beads. What beads? I asked. Her mother's. The blue glass ones. She left them on the kitchen table at Moses's house this morning. Uncle Oz grabbed his hat. They're the only thing of value his wife owned, the only thing Elwood ain't sold yet, and a desperate drunk man with a knife. He didn't need to finish. We ran for Moses's wagon. Uncle Oz, me, Moses, and the marshal. Clementine tried to follow, but Mrs. Keene held her back. The ride back felt like it took hours instead of minutes. When we pulled up to Moses's house, the front door stood open. Lamplight spilled out into the darkness. And there, standing on the porch with those blue beads dangling from one fist and a knife gleaming in the other, stood Elwood Thatch. His eyes were wild, unfocused. His shirt was stained. The smell of rot-gut whiskey preceded him by 10 feet. "Stop right there!" he screamed when he saw us climbing down. "Stop, or I'll destroy them. They're all I got left of her. All I got left." Uncle Oz raised his hands, empty, non-threatening. "Elwood, put the knife down. We can talk about this." "Talking's done," Elwood's voice cracked and splintered. "You took my daughter. The law took my freedom. I got nothing left. Nothing but these damn beads and a thirst that won't quit no matter how much I drink." "The beads aren't yours to sell," Marshal Breckenridge said, hand hovering near his gun. "Not anymore. Judge ruled your daughter's a free woman. That property belongs to her. She was mine first. My little girl. I got rights." Behind the marshal, I saw movement. Clementine had followed us somehow, running the whole way. She pushed past the men before anyone could stop her. She walked straight toward her father, toward that knife, like she wasn't afraid of anything anymore. Everyone shouted for her to stop. She didn't. She walked right up to within 5 feet of Elwood and held up her slate. She'd written something long, and she held it steady so he could read. "Take them. Sell them. Buy your bottle. But know this, when you're done drinking, when you wake up tomorrow with nothing left and no one left, remember you chose whiskey over your daughter twice. Once when you sold me, once when you stole from me. I forgive you for the first. I won't forgive the second. Choose, Papa. Choose right now what matters more." The night went silent, except for Elwood's ragged breathing and the distant sound of cicadas. Dawn was still hours away, but the moon hung full and bright, turning everything silver and sharp. And in that light, we all waited to see which way a broken man would fall. Elwood Thatch stood on that porch, knife in one hand, blue glass beads in the other, shaking like a man with fever. The moonlight made everything look unreal, silver and sharp and cold. He stared at Clementine's slate. "Read the words again." His face crumpled. "Baby girl," he whispered. I can't." "You can," Uncle Oz said quietly, stepping forward slow. "You can choose different right now. This moment, it ain't too late. It's been too late for 3 years, since the day Margaret died, and I couldn't save her. Your wife dying wasn't your fault, Elwood. The sickness took her, not you. I couldn't afford the medicine. I sold everything, and it still wasn't enough." His voice broke into pieces. "And then it was just me and Clem. And every time I looked at her, all I saw was my failure. So I drank. And I kept drinking until I couldn't see nothing at all." Clementine wrote on her slate, hands steady despite the knife 5 feet away. "Mama wouldn't want this. She'd want you to live. I don't know how to live anymore." "Then learn. Starting now. Starting with putting down the knife." The moment stretched thin and fragile. Elwood looked at the beads catching moonlight. Looked at his daughter, looked at the knife in his hand like he was surprised to find it there. Then slowly, so slowly I wasn't sure it was happening, he bent down and set the knife on the porch boards. He held the beads out toward Clementine, hands shaking so bad they rattled like rain. "I don't deserve your forgiveness," he said hoarsely. "I know that, but I'm asking anyway, not because I earned it, just because I'm asking." Clementine walked up those steps, took the beads from his trembling hands. Then she did something that made every man there catch his breath. She fastened them around his neck. Her slate read, "You gave these to Mama because you loved her. She would want you to have them back. Sell them if you must. But know this, every time you look at them before you sell them, remember you were once a man who loved enough to give a week's wages for pretty beads. Remember you can be that man again." Elwood touched the beads at his throat like they were made of fire. Tears ran down his weathered face into his beard, and he made sounds I'd never heard a grown man make. Broken sounds like something inside him was tearing loose. Marshal Breckenridge stepped forward, not unkind. Elwood, the sober house will take you back. But this is the last chance. You understand? You walk off this porch, you got a choice to make. Bottle or better, nobody can make it for you. I don't know if I'm strong enough. Nobody does until they try, Moses said. But you won't be alone. The men at the sober house, they understand. They've been where you are. Elwood stood slowly, unsteady on his feet. He looked at the beads around his neck, looked at Clementine, looked at the horizon where the moon was setting and dawn would come eventually. Then he unfastened the beads and held them out to his daughter. I choose better, he said, voice like gravel and hope mixed together. I don't know if I can do it, but I'm going to try, for her, for Margaret's memory. Clementine took the beads, wrote on her slate, I'll keep them safe. When you're ready, really ready, I'll give them back. She paused, erased, wrote more. Until then, you have to live like you want them back. Live like you deserve them. Elwood nodded, and something in his face had changed. Not fixed, not healed, but different. Like a door that had been locked for years had finally cracked open just enough to let light through. Marshal Breckenridge helped him to his horse. As they prepared to ride back to town, Elwood looked back one last time. Oswin Landry, he called. Thank you for showing me what a real father looks like, for being what I couldn't be. Uncle Oz's voice was rough. You got time to become that man, Elwood. Use it. They rode away into the darkness, leaving us standing in Moses's yard with relief so strong it made my knees weak. We were turning to go inside when Marshal Breckenridge came back up the road alone. He dismounted, walked to Uncle Oz, and pulled out his leather notebook, the one he was always writing in, documenting everything. Oz, I need to show you something. He opened the book, page after page of notes, dates, times, witness statements. Every conversation since the auction, every detail about Clementine's circumstances, the mob visits, Dalton's threats, everything. I've been building a case, Breckenridge said quietly, not against you, for you. Uncle Oz stared at him. What? Judge Blackwell wanted to issue that writ of moral turpitude. He's a hard man, follows the letter of the law. But I've been documenting everything that's happened. The fraud at the company store, the mob intimidation, Dalton Keene's harassment, the illegal eviction from company housing. He tapped the notebook. This is 30 pages of evidence that you've been the victim, not the perpetrator. Marshal, why would you? Because 15 years ago, my daughter ran off with a drifter. She was 17. I was so busy being the law, enforcing what was proper and right, I forgot to be her father. She died in a charity hospital in Missouri, and I never got to tell her I was sorry. His voice went rough. I won't watch another girl get ground up by propriety when a good man's trying to do right. Not again. Uncle Oz's throat worked. I don't know what to say. Don't say nothing. Just let me do my job properly this time. Breckenridge closed the notebook. Judge Blackwell's reviewing this tomorrow, with Mrs. Keene's evidence about the fraudulent debt and my documentation of everything else. He's prepared to issue a ruling in your favor. What kind of ruling? Legal guardianship. Clementine becomes your ward, officially, permanently, until she reaches majority or chooses independence. No one can challenge it without going through 3 levels of appeals, which, given the evidence, ain't likely to succeed. Hope flickered in Uncle Oz's chest. I could see it in his face, fighting against years of learning not to hope for anything. That's good news, he managed. It is, but Oz, there's something else. The marshal's face went grim. Dalton Keene found out about the judge's pending ruling, and he's not taking it well. My stomach dropped. What do you mean? I mean he's calling an emergency meeting at the mill tomorrow morning. All the workers. Says he's got an announcement that affects everyone. Breckenridge looked at Uncle Oz. Word is, he's planning to make an example. Thinks if he can turn the mill workers against you, the judge will have to reconsider. An example how? Don't know yet, but Dalton's been drinking since this afternoon, and drunk men with wounded pride do stupid things. The marshal mounted his horse. Meetings at dawn. I'll be there. You might want to be there too. He rode off, leaving us in the pre-dawn darkness with one question hanging in the air. What was Dalton planning? Uncle Oz sat on Moses's porch steps, head in his hands. I'd never seen him look so tired, so worn down. Clementine came and sat beside him, not touching, just present. After a moment, she wrote on her slate and showed it to him. You've lost your house, nearly lost your job, been threatened, humiliated, pushed to the edge. Why haven't you given up? Uncle Oz read it and was quiet for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. Because the day I give up on doing right is the day I become the kind of man who watches girls get sold and tells himself it ain't his business. I'd rather lose everything than become that man. She erased and wrote, You haven't lost everything. You still have us. Us? Me and Silas. We're still here. That's not nothing. Uncle Oz looked at her then, really looked at her, and something passed between them that I was too young to fully understand but old enough to recognize as important. No, he said softly. That's not nothing. That's everything that matters. Dawn broke cold and gray over Moses's house. We dressed in silence, ate a quick breakfast of cold biscuits, and climbed into the wagon. The ride to the mill felt like riding to judgment. When we arrived, the yard was already packed with trucks and horses. Every worker from the mill was there. Maybe 100 men, some with their wives. They stood in clusters, whispering, watching as we pulled up. Dalton Keene stood on a makeshift platform near the main building, his father beside him. Mr. Keene Sr. looked uncomfortable, but he was there. That's what mattered. As we climbed down from the wagon, I saw the faces in the crowd, some friendly, Moses and the men who'd helped us move, some neutral. Some openly hostile, like they'd already decided we were the problem. Dalton saw us and smiled. Not friendly, predatory. Well, well, he called out loud enough for everyone to hear. Oswin Landry, brave of you to show your face. Uncle Oz didn't respond, just walked through the crowd toward the platform, me and Clementine following close behind. Marshal Breckenridge was already there, standing off to the side, hand resting casual on his gun belt. When he saw us, he gave a slight nod. Whatever was about to happen, we weren't facing it alone. But as Dalton raised his hands for quiet and the crowd pressed closer, I felt it in my bones. This was the moment everything would either break or bend. And I had no idea which way it would go. Dalton Keene stood on that platform like a preacher at a revival, except his gospel was spite and wounded pride dressed up as righteousness. Gentlemen, he began, voice carrying across the packed mill yard. We've gathered here this morning because a situation has arisen that threatens the very foundation of this operation. The crowd murmured. Uncle Oz stood still as stone, jaw set. My father built this mill on principles, Dalton continued. Hard work, discipline, moral uprightness. We employ half this county. We feed families. We are the backbone of this community. He paused for effect. But lately, those principles have been challenged, undermined, made a mockery of. He pointed directly at Uncle Oz. Oswin Landry was foreman of this mill for 8 years, a position of trust, of leadership. And what did he do with that trust? He brought shame to this operation. He bought a woman at public auction. I paid a debt, Uncle Oz said, voice cutting through Dalton's speech. Nothing more. You brought her to your home, an unmarried man and a woman of questionable circumstance, living under one roof with a minor child, creating scandal. Forcing this mill to choose between its values and— What values? Moses Freeman's voice rang out from the crowd. The value of watching a girl get sold like livestock and doing nothing? Dalton's face flushed. That's not the issue here. Then what is the issue? Another voice called, Carl Pritchett stepping forward. Because it seems to me the only one creating scandal is you, Dalton, showing up at a man's house with torches and threats in the middle of the night. The crowd stirred. Some men nodded agreement, others looked uncertain. Mr. Keene Sr. stepped forward then, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of 40 years running a business. Gentlemen, My son is correct that we must maintain standards, but he's also young and, he paused, choosing words carefully, zealous in his interpretation of those standards. He looked at Uncle Oz. Oswin, you put me in a difficult position. Your actions, however well-intentioned, created controversy. Controversy costs money, costs reputation. In business, these things matter. I understand that, sir. Do you? Because I'm not sure you do. Mr. Keene pulled papers from his coat. This is your employment contract, signed 8 years ago. It stipulates that as foreman, you represent the mill's interests at all times, in all matters. Your personal conduct reflects on this operation. Yes, sir. Then you understand that I have grounds for termination, not reassignment. Termination. The crowd went silent. Uncle Oz's face didn't change, but I saw his hands clench at his sides. However, Mr. Keene continued, and hope flickered, I'm a practical man. You're the best foreman I've ever had, so I'm prepared to offer you a choice. What choice? Return to work. Full reinstatement. But the girl goes to the county poor farm as originally mandated. You sever all connection with her. Make a public statement that your intervention was a mistake born of temporary poor judgment. He paused. Or you refuse, and you're terminated. Blacklisted. You'll never work a mill in 3 counties. Your choice. The words hung in the air like smoke from a gun. Uncle Oz looked at Mr. Keene, at Dalton smirking beside him, at the crowd of men whose respect he'd earned over 8 years, at me, standing there trying not to cry, at Clementine, holding her slate with both hands, face pale. With respect, sir, Uncle Oz said slowly, I can't do that. You're choosing poverty over employment, over your nephew's welfare? I'm choosing dignity over comfort, and I'm teaching my nephew that some things matter more than a paycheck. Dalton laughed, sharp and cruel. Dignity. You'll have plenty of dignity when you're sleeping in a ditch. Maybe so, but at least I'll sleep. Mr. Keene's face hardened. Then you're fired, effective immediately. And I'll make sure every mill owner in this region knows you're a troublemaker who puts personal politics over professional duty. He turned to the crowd. Let this be a lesson. Sentiment is fine in church, but in business, in the real world, you follow the rules or you suffer the consequences. That's when Moses Freeman stepped onto the platform uninvited. Mr. Keene, with respect, I got something to say. Moses, this doesn't concern, it concerns every man here. Moses turned to face the crowd. Oz Landry covered my shifts for 2 weeks when my grandson was sick. Didn't ask for nothing in return. Didn't hold it over me. Just did it because it was right. Another man spoke up. Vernon Hobbs, who'd ridden with the first mob. He helped me fix my truck last winter. Spent a whole Saturday in the cold. Wouldn't take payment. Carl Pritchett. He loaned me money when I had gambling debts. Didn't ask questions. Didn't judge. One by one, men stepped forward, sharing stories. Small kindnesses. Moments of grace they'd received from Uncle Oz over 8 years of working together. Finally, Moses said, Mr. Keene, you want to fire Oz? That's your right as owner. But understand this, if he goes, we go too. All of us. The crowd rumbled agreement. Mr. Keene's face went pale. You're threatening a strike? We're stating fact. You got the best foreman in 3 counties, and you got men willing to walk away from wages in the middle of the Depression to stand with him. That should tell you something about the kind of man he is. Dalton sputtered. Father, you can't let them. But Mr. Keene raised his hand for silence. He looked at the crowd, at Uncle Oz, at Moses standing defiant on the platform. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Mrs. Keene's voice cut through the tension. Might I say something? She'd appeared at the edge of the crowd, Clementine beside her. She walked through the parting men like she owned the place, which, in a way, she did. Marjorie, this is business, Mr. Keene began. And I'm part of this business. Half owner, remember, per our marriage contract. She stood at the base of the platform. Gentlemen, my husband is a good man who's been given bad advice by an impulsive son, but I have information that changes everything. She pulled documents from her handbag. Yesterday, Judge Blackwell ruled on several matters. First, the debt that resulted in Clementine Thatch's sale was fraudulent. The store clerk has been arrested. Second, given the circumstances and the evidence Marshal Breckenridge compiled, the judge has granted Oswin Landry full legal guardianship of Miss Thatch. The crowd erupted in murmurs. This means, Mrs. Keene continued, raising her voice, that everything my son accused Mr. Landry of, moral turpitude, improper living arrangements, is now legally sanctioned and protected. Miss Thatch is his ward. Their household is legitimate in the eyes of the law, she turned to her husband. So the question becomes, are you going to fire a man for following the law? Or are you going to admit this entire spectacle was orchestrated by our son's wounded pride? Mr. Keene looked at the papers, at his wife, at Dalton, whose face had gone from red to white. The law changed, Dalton protested weakly. Yesterday it was illegal. Today it's none of your business, his father said sharply, and hasn't been from the start. He stepped to the front of the platform, papers still in hand. The crowd went silent. Oswin Landry, he said formally, I'm offering you your position back. Full reinstatement as foreman. 15% raise. Company housing restored. And it's yours permanently, regardless of employment status. I'm putting it in writing. Uncle Oz just stared at him. Furthermore, Mr. Keene continued, my son will be working the mill floor for the next 6 months to relearn what leadership actually means, and he'll be apologizing to you, publicly, right now. Dalton's face went purple. Father, I won't. You will, or you'll find yourself working somewhere else entirely. Your choice. The silence stretched thin and taut. Finally, Dalton stepped forward. The words came out like he was chewing glass. I apologize for overstepping. For what specifically? Moses prompted, not letting him off easy. Dalton's jaw clenched. For the mob, for the threats, for the eviction, for everything. It wasn't gracious, it wasn't heartfelt, but it was public, and it was enough. Uncle Oz nodded once. Apology accepted. Mr. Keene extended his hand. Do we have an agreement? Uncle Oz looked at that hand, at the crowd of men who'd stood up for him, at Clementine, tears streaming down her face, at me, grinning so wide my face hurt. He shook Mr. Keene's hand. Yes, sir, we do. The crowd erupted in cheers. But as the celebration began, as men clapped Uncle Oz on the back and Moses produced a bottle of something celebratory, Marshal Breckenridge appeared at Uncle Oz's elbow. His face was grim. Oz, we got a problem. What now, Marshal? Ain't we had enough problems for 1 week? It's Elwood Thatch. He never made it to the sober house last night. My stomach dropped. What do you mean? I mean he got as far as the edge of town, turned his horse around, and rode north. Deputy found the horse this morning, wandering loose. No sign of Elwood. Clementine gripped her slate so tight her knuckles went white. Where would he go? Uncle Oz asked. Don't know. But Oz, the marshal's voice dropped. He still had that kitchen knife, and he was wearing those blue glass beads around his neck. The celebration faded to background noise. All I could hear was my heartbeat and the marshal's next words. We need to find him. Soon, before he hurts himself or, he glanced at Clementine, or tries to finish what he started. Uncle Oz's expression hardened. He's going after something. But what? Clementine wrote on her slate with shaking hands. My mother's grave. He's going to my mother's grave. And suddenly we were running for the wagons, leaving the celebration behind, racing against time and a broken man's desperation toward a cemetery on the edge of the county where dawn was breaking cold and final over weathered headstones. The cemetery sat on a hill 3 miles outside town, surrounded by a rusted iron fence and wind-bent trees. We'd pushed the horses hard getting there, and they stood lathered and heaving while we jumped down and ran through the gate. The sun was just breaking over the horizon, painting everything in shades of gold and blood red. We found Elwood at his wife's grave. He knelt in the dirt, the blue glass beads clutched in one hand, the knife lying beside him in the grass. His other hand rested on the weathered headstone. Margaret Ann Thatch, 1895 to 1930, beloved wife and mother. He wasn't moving. For one terrible moment, I thought we were too late, thought he'd used that knife on himself. Then his shoulders shook, and I realized he was crying. Deep, wrenching sobs that tore out of him like they'd been buried for 3 years and were finally clawing their way to the surface. Uncle Oz approached slowly, hands visible. Elwood. The man didn't look up. I came to tell her what I'd done, about selling Clem, about the drinking, about becoming the kind of man she'd be ashamed to know. His voice was raw, scraped hollow. Figured she ought to hear it from me before I ended things. Marshal Breckenridge's hand moved toward his gun, but Uncle Oz waved him off. "And what did she say?" Uncle Oz asked quietly, moving closer. "She didn't say nothing. She's dead." Elwood laughed, a horrible sound. "I'm sitting here talking to a stone like a crazy person. Maybe, or maybe you're talking to your conscience and it just happens to be buried here." Uncle Oz knelt beside him in the dirt, ignoring protocol and danger. What would Margaret say if she could? Really? Elwood was quiet for a long time. She'd say I was a damn fool. She'd say our daughter deserved better. She'd say, his voice cracked. She'd say 3 years of drinking was long enough to mourn, and it was time to start living again. Sounds like a wise woman. She was too good for me, that's for sure. He touched the headstone gentle, like it might break. I loved her so much it hurt, and when she died, I didn't know how to stop hurting except to pour whiskey on it. But the hurt never went away, just got bigger, meaner. Clementine appeared beside Uncle Oz. She knelt in the grass across from her father, slate in hand. She wrote carefully, "Mama wouldn't want you to die. She'd want you to be the man she married, the one who gave a week's wages for blue beads because they matched her eyes." Elwood read it, and fresh tears came. "I don't know if that man exists anymore, baby girl." Then build him again, one day at a time, one choice at a time. She held out her hand across the grave, palm up, an invitation, a bridge. For a long moment, Elwood just stared at it. Then, slowly, he took her hand. "I'm so sorry," he whispered, "for all of it, for failing you, for selling you, for—" Clementine squeezed his hand and wrote with her free one, "I forgive you. Now you have to forgive yourself." Marshal Breckenridge helped Elwood to his feet. "The sober house is still waiting, but Elwood, this is it. Last chance. You understand?" "I understand." "You walk away from there again. I can't help you. Judge has already been lenient given the circumstances." "I know." Elwood looked at Clementine. Can I visit? Once I get myself straight?" "If you're willing," she wrote, "when you're ready, really ready, not before." He nodded and let the marshal lead him away. Uncle Oz stood, dusting dirt from his knees. He picked up the knife from the grass, evidence probably, and handed it to a deputy. As we walked back toward the wagons, the sun fully up now and warm on our faces, I felt something shift, like a chapter closing and a new one beginning. We were almost to the cemetery gate when a voice called out, "Oz, wait!" Carl Pritchett came running up the hill, out of breath. Behind him, 3 more men from the mill. "Carl," Uncle Oz said, wary, "what are you doing here?" Carl stopped, bent over, hands on his knees, gasping. Had to tell you something, before you heard it from someone else." "Tell me what?" Carl straightened up, and his face was twisted with shame. "It was me, Oz. I'm the one who told Dalton about Clementine, about her being at your house, about the whole situation." The world went still. "You?" Uncle Oz's voice was flat, empty. "I owed Dalton money. Gambling debts from cards at the tavern. Near 3 months' wages worth. He said if I helped him get dirt on you, helped him build a case to push you out, he'd forgive what I owed." Carl's voice shook. "I didn't know it would go this far. I swear to God, Oz, I thought he just wanted leverage for negotiations or something. I didn't know about the mobs, the eviction, none of it." Uncle Oz just stared at him. Carl had been in our house, had eaten at our table, had been the one to teach me how to tie knots when I was 7 years old. "You sold me out," Uncle Oz said quietly, "for gambling debts. I know, and I can't take it back. But Oz, I got to tell you." Carl stepped closer. "Dalton ain't done. This morning at the mill, after you left with the marshal, he was raging, talking about how his father humiliated him, how you took everything from him. I didn't take nothing. He gave it away by being a fool. I know that, you know that, but Dalton don't see it that way. Carl glanced back at the other men who'd come with him. He's planning something. Don't know what exactly, but he was meeting with the company lawyer and some men from out of town. Hard men, not mill workers. Marshal Breckenridge stepped forward. What kind of men? The kind that break strikes. The kind that make problems disappear. Carl's face was pale. Oz, I betrayed you once. I ain't gonna do it twice. Whatever Dalton's planning, it ain't legal and it ain't right, and I'll testify to that if it comes to it. Uncle Oz looked at Carl for a long moment. I waited for him to explode, to hit him, to do something violent and justified. Instead, he said, Why? Why tell me this now? Because I went home last night after the mill meeting, told my wife what I'd done. She looked at me like I was a stranger. Said she didn't marry a man who sold out his friends for 30 pieces of silver. Said if I didn't make it right, she'd take the kids and leave. Carl's voice cracked. And she was right. I became the kind of man I despise. So I'm here trying to undo what I can, even if it's too late. Uncle Oz was quiet. Then, it ain't too late. But Carl, you gotta live with what you done. Gotta carry it. Can't just confess and call it square. I know. And you owe Clementine the apology more than me. She's the one who suffered most from your betrayal. Carl turned to Clementine, who stood silent with her slate. Miss Thatch, I'm sorry. I got no excuse and I ain't asking for forgiveness. Just wanted you to know I'm ashamed of what I done. She looked at him for a long moment, then wrote, My father sold me for whiskey. You sold Oz for cards. Different vices, same weakness. But my father's trying to change. Are you? Yes, ma'am. I swear it. Then prove it. Not with words. With what you do next. Uncle Oz turned to Marshal Breckenridge. Marshal, if Dalton's hiring muscle from out of town, then we got bigger problems than I can handle alone. Breckenridge pulled out his pocket watch. It's Sunday. Judge won't be available until tomorrow morning. But if what Carl says is true, Dalton might move before then. What do we do? The marshal thought for a moment. We do what you've been doing. We stand together. We make sure there's witnesses to everything, and we trust that right will prevail. He looked at Carl. Pritchett, you willing to sign a statement about what you heard? Yes, sir. Good. Then let's get back to town. I want this documented before nightfall. We rode back in heavy silence. The celebration from the mill had faded into memory, replaced by new threats and old betrayals. As we approached town, Moses's wagon pulled alongside ours. He leaned over. Oz, the men want to help. Whatever's coming, we stand with you. Moses, you got families to think about. If Dalton's bringing in strikebreakers, then he's going to find out what a real strike looks like. Moses's face was grim. We already lost too many good men to rich boys throwing tantrums, not losing another one. Uncle Oz nodded, throat working. We rolled into town as the church bells rang for evening services. People were gathering on porches, in doorways, watching us pass. Word had spread about the mill meeting, about the confrontation, about everything. Some faces were friendly, some suspicious, some just curious. But everyone was watching, and as we pulled up to Moses's house, where Clementine's few belongings still waited to be moved back to our restored home, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A stranger stood across the street. Big man, scarred face, dressed in black. He wasn't from around here. I knew every face in this county. He watched us with cold eyes. When Uncle Oz met his gaze, the man smiled slow and mean. Then he turned and walked away, disappearing into an alley. Who was that? I asked. Trouble, Uncle Oz said quietly. That was trouble. And as the sun set over our small town, casting long shadows that looked like reaching hands, I knew we weren't done yet. The fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. That night, Uncle Oz didn't sleep. None of us did. We sat on Moses's porch with rifles across our laps, watching the road, waiting for whatever Dalton had planned. The stranger in black never came. But at dawn, something else did. A wagon rolled up the street. Not threatening, just steady. When it stopped in front of Moses's house, Mr. Keene Sr. climbed down. Alone. No lawyer. No Dalton. Just an old man who looked like he'd aged 10 years overnight. Oz, he called. Can we talk? Just you and me? Uncle Oz handed me his rifle and walked down to meet him in the road. I watched from the porch, Clementine beside me. They talked for maybe 10 minutes. I couldn't hear the words, but I could read the body language. Mr. Keene's shoulders sagging, Uncle Oz's face going from wary to surprised to something softer. Finally, they shook hands. Mr. Keene climbed back in his wagon and drove away. Uncle Oz walked back up to the porch, face unreadable. What did he say? I asked. Uncle Oz sat down heavy, like his legs wouldn't hold him anymore. He said Dalton left town last night, took money from the mill accounts and ran. Marshall's already wired the neighboring counties. Left? Moses had come out to listen. Why? Because Mrs. Keene found out about the men he was hiring. Strikebreakers from Oklahoma City, men with criminal records. She went to the judge, showed him proof Dalton was planning to incite violence. Judge issued a warrant for conspiracy to commit assault. My mouth fell open. So he just ran? Looks that way. Uncle Oz rubbed his face. Mr. Keene came to apologize. Said his son's actions don't represent the mill. Said he's ashamed of what his family put us through. That all he said? No. Uncle Oz looked at Clementine. He said the mill's setting up a fund for workers who need help. Medical emergencies, family crises, whatever. Said it's in your name. The Clementine Thatch Dignity Fund. Any worker can apply, no questions asked, no debt incurred. It's his way of making amends. Clementine's hands went to her mouth. Her slate clattered to the porch. There's more, Uncle Oz continued quietly. The company store clerk who falsified Elwood's debt, he's been doing it to other families too. Dozens of them. Judge Blackwell's reviewing every account going back 5 years. Anyone who was overcharged is getting restitution, and the store's being audited by the state. Moses whistled low. One girl getting sold just brought down a whole system of fraud. Looks like it. We sat in silence, trying to process how everything had changed so fast. From mob threats and eviction to this. Vindication, justice, redemption all at once. What about Dalton? I asked. Will they catch him? Probably. Man like that, soft-handed and angry, he won't last long on the run. But that's the marshal's problem now, not ours. 3 days later, we moved back into our house on the ridge. The mill workers had kept it clean while we were gone. Someone had even planted flowers by the porch. Moses's wife, probably. Clementine had her own room now. Uncle Oz had spent 2 days building her a proper bed frame, a desk for her slate and books, shelves for the few possessions she'd accumulated. It wasn't much, but it was hers. That evening, we sat on the porch, all 3 of us, watching the sun set over the valley. Uncle Oz whittled. I did homework. Clementine mended a shirt. Normal. Domestic, family. Uncle Oz? I said eventually. What happens now? What do you mean? I mean, is it over? Really over? He set down his carving, a fox this time, detailed and perfect. Boy, trouble's never really over. There'll always be something. But the question ain't whether trouble comes. It's whether you got people to stand with you when it does. He looked at Clementine. She'd been quiet all day, processing everything. You all right? He asked her. She wrote on her slate. I keep waiting for it to fall apart, for someone to say it was a mistake. It wasn't a mistake. Then what was it? Uncle Oz thought for a long moment. It was a bunch of broken people choosing to be less broken together. That's all family ever is, really. She smiled, not big, but real. Then she wrote, Thank you for choosing me. Thank you for staying. 6 months later, on a spring morning that smelled like pine and possibilities, Marshal Breckenridge rode up with news. Elwood Thatch had stayed sober, 4 months and counting. He'd gotten work at a lumber camp up north, writing letters to Clementine every week. The letters were short, awkward, but consistent, and he wanted to visit, if she was willing. Clementine thought about it for 3 days. Finally, she wrote her answer on her slate and showed it to Uncle Oz. Yes, but not alone. With you there. You sure? He's your father. You don't need me. You're my father too. Both can be true. So when Elwood came, thin and weathered but with clear eyes and steady hands, we all sat together on that porch. He brought the blue glass beads, the ones Clementine had told him to keep until he was ready. I'm ready, he said simply, holding them out. She took them, fastened them around her neck. They caught the light, turning her eyes storm cloud blue. I'm proud of you, Papa, she said. Spoke it out loud, words rough but clear. She'd been practicing with Uncle Oz, getting her voice back bit by bit. Elwood's face crumpled. Baby girl, I don't deserve... None of us deserve grace. That's what makes it grace. She'd learned that from Uncle Oz. Now she was teaching it back to her father. They talked for hours that day, about Margaret, about the farm, about mistakes and amends and the long road of recovery. It wasn't healed, not yet, but it was healing, and that was enough. Years later, long after I'd grown and left, long after the Depression ended and the mill modernized, long after Elwood died sober with his daughter holding his hand, people still talked about the autumn of 1933, about the girl who was sold and the man who bought her freedom, about the mob that came with torches and the foreman who wouldn't back down, about how one act of dignity sparked a whole community to remember what mattered. The Clementine Thatch Dignity Fund still exists, helps dozens of families a year. And every application is approved with the same words stamped at the bottom. Dignity cannot be bought or sold, but it can be given back. I'm 67 now, telling this story to my grandchildren on the same porch where it mostly happened. The house has been updated, electricity, indoor plumbing, all the modern things, but the bones are the same. Uncle Oz died in 1967, age 81, still whittling wooden animals in his spare time. Clementine went 3 months later, like she couldn't stand the quiet without him. They're buried side by side on the ridge, under the oak tree Uncle Oz planted the year she came to stay. The headstone he carved himself says, Oswin Landry, 1886 to 1967. Clementine Thatch Landry, 1914 to 1967. They chose each other when the world said they shouldn't. That choice changed everything. My youngest grandson asks, Great-Grandpa Silas, were you scared when the mob came? Terrified, I tell him honestly. But I learned something that night. Being afraid don't mean you're weak. It means you're human. What matters is what you do while you're afraid. What did you do? I stood up, held a rusty gun I couldn't shoot, stood beside my uncle and a girl I barely knew, because sometimes standing up is all you got. He thinks about this, serious like. Would you do it again? I look at the sunset painting the valley gold and red, at the house that almost wasn't ours, at the life that grew from one choice on one September day in 1933. Every single time, I tell him. Every single time. The wind moves through the oak tree, and I swear I hear it. Uncle Oz's voice, rough and gentle. That's how it's done, boy. That's how grace keeps going. And somewhere, in the fading light, I see them. Uncle Oz and Clementine, sitting on this porch like they used to, whittling and mending, together in the way that matters most. Chosen family, the kind that lasts forever. I'm fixing to close this story now, but before I do, I need you to understand something. I've told you about September 1933, about a man named Oswin Landry who paid $43 for a girl's freedom, about mobs with torches and mills and the price of standing up when everyone else sits down. But here's what I ain't said yet. That story never ended. It's still happening, right now, wherever you are. Every time someone stands up for somebody who can't stand up for themselves, that's Uncle Oz on that porch with his shotgun. Every time someone forgives what can't be earned, that's Clementine with her father's beads. Every time someone chooses what's right over what's easy, that's Moses Freeman and those mill workers walking off the job. Every time someone gives grace when the world says it's too expensive, that story continues. See, Uncle Oz used to tell me something I didn't understand until I got old enough to have my own regrets. Silas, you're gonna face 1,000 moments in your life where you gotta choose between comfort and courage, between dollars and dignity, between what's legal and what's right. The easy choice won't haunt you in the moment, but 30 years later, you'll wake up at 3 a.m. wondering who you could have been if you'd been braver. I think about that a lot now. I'm 67 years old, and I can count on one hand the times I was really brave. Times I stood up when sitting down would have been easier. Times I chose people over comfort. Every one of those times cost me something, and every one of them was worth it. So here's what I'm asking you, friend, wherever you are right now. If you were on that porch, would you have stood? If you were holding that slate, would you have stayed? If you were offered those beads, would you have forgiven and the answer to those questions, that's who you really are. Not who you think you are, not who you tell people you are, but who you are when the mob shows up and you got to decide, run or stand. Uncle Oz died believing the world was full of good people who just needed permission to be brave. I hope to God he was right, because dignity ain't something you're born with or inherit or buy. It's something you choose, every day, every moment, every time the world says, look away, and something inside you says, not this time. You can't buy dignity. You can't sell it. You can't take it from someone who refuses to give it up. All you can do is choose it. And when you choose it for yourself, when you stand up for it in others, that's when you become the kind of person whose life means something beyond the years you're given. September 1933 was a long time ago. The people in this story are all gone now, dust and memory and carved headstones on a ridge in Arkansas. But the truth they lived by, that's eternal. Family is who you choose to stand with when the torches come. Dignity is what you got left when everything else is taken. And grace, real grace, the kind that costs you something, that's what turns strangers into family and shame into redemption. Maybe you're listening to this in a truck at 2 a.m., trying to stay awake on a long haul. Maybe you're in a house that don't feel like home, wondering if it ever will. Maybe you've been the one sold, the one dismissed, the one told you ain't worth much, or maybe you've been the one who looked away when you should have stood up, and you're carrying that weight still. Whoever you are, wherever you are, I'm telling you this. It's not too late. You can still choose dignity. You can still choose to stand. You can still be the person in someone else's story who made the difference. Uncle Oz was just a sawmill foreman. Clementine was just a deaf girl sold for grain debt. I was just a 12-year-old kid with a rusty pistol. We weren't nobody special, but we chose each other when the world said we shouldn't. And that choice? That choice changed everything. If this story touched you, if it made you remember someone you lost, or wish you'd been braver for, or reminded you what matters when everything else falls away, I'd like to know. Tell me where you're listening from. Drop a comment, send a message, whatever feels right. Tell me about the Uncle Oz in your life. Tell me about the time you stood up or the time you wish you had. Because these stories, they only die if we let them die. As long as we keep telling them, keep living them, keep choosing dignity over dollars and people over comfort, they're alive. The close. Until next time, friend, may your dignity carry you through the hard seasons. May you stand when others sit. May you give grace when the world says it's too expensive. And may you always remember, you're not what was done to you, you're what you do next. This has been the story of Oswin Landry, Clementine Thatch, and a September in 1933 that changed 3 lives forever. My name is Silas Landry, and I was there. God bless you wherever you are.